Our third and final inductee, Steve Dalkowski, will be introduced by Ron Shelton, who is no stranger to these festivities. In 2000, Ron introduced Bill Spaceman Lee prior to his induction into the Shrine of the Eternals. A former minor league ball player who spent 5 years in the Baltimore Orioles system from 1967 to 1971, Ron played in some of the same towns and leagues as Steve Dalkowski only a few years later. Towns in the Appalachian, California, and international leagues. After retiring from baseball, Ron worked a variety of jobs, eventually entering the world of filmmaking as a writer and director. He has established himself as one of the preeminent filmmakers of the last 20 years, with his filmography including, among others, Bull Durham, White Men Can't Jump, Tin Cup, Play It to the Bone, Hollywood Homicide, and the forthcoming Game of Shadows. It is my distinct honor to welcome to the podium Ron Shelton.
Okay, first of all, was it Caleri? Who was the one that said earlier that the 69 Mets was a sign that God exists? As a former as property of the Baltimore Orioles, as was Steve Dalkowski, I want to give an alternative theological interpretation because the Baltimore Orioles were, for 20 years, far and away the best organization and the most successful organization in baseball. And in 1969, I just had my best year in the minor leagues and had been invited to the Winter Ball in Florida with 24 other minor leaguers. And that was the year of that series, of course, and we all watched it and then went out and did the workouts in the morning and played the exhibition games in the afternoon under the tutelage of all the Oriole staff. However, the morning after the last game of the 69 series, us 25 minor leaguers reported for duty in our uniforms at 9 in the morning. And Frank Lane, famous Frank Lane, who was then an executive for the Orioles, came out and said, "Gentlemen, I want to put in perspective what you just saw." He said, "It proves only one thing, and that is that some days the sun even shines on a dog's ass." Now run some laps right now, please. So that is how I interpreted the 69 World Series. When I signed with Baltimore, I'm a Southern California native. When I signed and flew from LAX to the Appalachian League and knew I wasn't in Santa Barbara anymore, where I'd grown up, and started, my first manager was Joe Altobelli, who was just beginning a career after a long professional career, sometimes in the major leagues, a lot in AAA, and he was starting now as a manager, not unlike Crash Davis did at the end of Bull Durham, but that was not even a twinkle in my eye. Joe Altobelli ended up being my manager for a number of the years, seasons I went up as he went up, and in the other years it was Cal Ripken Sr. was my manager, and a kid named Cal Ripken Jr. was the bat boy. And I expected to be hearing these stories of Boog Powell and Jim Palmer and Brooks Robinson and all these great homegrown Orioles, Paul Blair. And everywhere I went in these little ballparks, I was hearing stories about a guy I'd never heard of named Steve Dalkowski. And not only did everybody, it was a guy that everybody agreed upon. There was no guy from another organization, from the Dodgers or Yankees, he said, "Well, that's just Oriole talk." Everybody said the same thing. This was the hardest thrower who ever lived. Now, as I went through the minor leagues, the stories, the legends were everywhere. Wilson, North Carolina, which is low minor leagues in some version of the Carolina League, I think it's below the Carolina League, where the screen is 60 feet behind the plate, So from pitcher's mound to the screen is 120 feet. Cal Ripken, Sr., who was Steve's catcher for many years, said he threw one up 25 feet up the screen that went through the welded wire mesh. Herm Starrett, pitching coach, said he threw one through a wooden fence. There was a story he stepped through the clubhouse at Stockton, where I played for a couple of years, and on a bet, could he throw it from dead center field, where the clubhouse was, to home plate? He threw it over the screen. It was 441 feet from home plate to center field in that ballpark. Nobody even hit one out of that ballpark. Everywhere you go, the stories of Steve Dalkowski. And they were accompanied by the stories of whatever happened to Steve Dalkowski. Because when I was in the minor leagues, sometimes a figure who turned out to be Steve Dalkowski would come and hang out in the shadows and try to connect with Joe Altobelli, who he knew and had played with in the minors. And we wondered, how could a man who threw this hard end up like this? And it was very telling. It was a growing up moment for everybody, because you're all 22 and think you're going to the Hall of Fame. Well, later on, when I got to work my way up to AAA, Altobelli started telling more and more stories. And one of them was when Steve Dalkowski finally got to AAA. Now, it took the better part of a decade to get to AAA. And I will abbreviate it by how he finally got to AAA is when he got to AA, and by the way, just for the minor leagues, there's 1 million leagues from rookie league to the Appalachian League. Getting out of A-ball is the hard part. Because everybody throws hard in A-ball, but they don't know where it's going. Once you get to AA or AAA, the game is played at a more predictable, albeit tougher level. It was much easier to play the higher I went. Getting out of Bluefield is the hard part, where you don't have these lights even. Well, Earl Weaver was the great Earl Weaver, soon to be the great Earl Weaver, was the manager at Elmira, a AA team in the Eastern League. And when Dalkowski made it to AA, Earl, who was a brilliant, brilliant baseball guy, said, I think he's overcoached. Everybody's got a theory. It's like a golfer with too many swing thoughts. Just don't throw so hard, Steve. Some of you know that was the advice that Sandy Koufax got when he got out of Brooklyn after being the wild man. They said, why don't you throw 3/4, Sandy? And so Steve started, after all these years, lighting up on it, if you can believe it. And for one magical summer in the Eastern League, Steve Dalkowski was the best pitcher who ever threw a ball. He had 104 strikeouts in 52 innings. He had almost no walks. I think there was 1 earned run in 60 innings. He was unhittable. He was still throwing, we think, at 100. Nobody quite knows. They know that he might have approached 110 because Baltimore once took him, this was before the radar guns, to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, which was a military facility outside Baltimore, and set up one of those tubes like you see at the track meets to judge the wind and at the long jump or the sprints. And in sneakers and without a mound, Steve threw for over 45 minutes before he could get one through the darn tube, and it registered in the mid-90s. So he made it to AAA. Joe Altobelli was still playing in AAA at the time at Rochester, New York, where I played. And they roomed Steve with Joe because Joe was such a veteran and a mature guy. And I said, Joe, what was it like to room with such a party animal? And he says, I never saw him. He didn't see him in the room. He saw him at the ballpark at 4 o'clock all season. I said, what was he like? He says, I love Steve. Everybody loves Steve. Everybody but opposing hitters love Steve. Steve Dalkowski didn't have an enemy in the world. He just had a God-gifted arm and a love for the bottle, which I have fought many times in my life and understand. Steve would show up at the ballpark and throw 100-plus miles an hour with barely a warm-up. By the way, there's a lot of things have been written about how Steve Dalkowski and Bull Durham connect. The idea of a gifted, wild, out-of-control young pitcher being roomed with a veteran minor leaguer was a part of the genesis for where Bull Durham came from. At any rate, so Steve gets to AAA and does well enough, throwing three-quarter speed, to go to the spring training with the Baltimore Orioles the next year. And although whether it's Phil Linz, wherever Mike Shen was talking about Phil Linz, or Jim Bouton, both, there's two versions of the story. Throwing to first base in an exhibition game, Steve's arm went bad, tore a ligament, and the gift was gone. Although a comeback attempt a couple years later, he still threw in the low 90s with a sore arm before he finally hung it up. By the way, in that exhibition season, he struck out Roger Maris on 3 straight. The Yankees were buzzing about him. It was this famous spring where Ted Williams stepped in against him and says, I want no part of that. Ted Williams is on record saying he was the hardest thrower he ever saw, Steve Dalkowski. By the way, because as I said in the LA Times piece this morning, one of the great things about baseball, everybody talks about the legends and the myth, and they grow and they grow and they grow. I know that I hit a home run in college that grows by 5 feet every year I go back to visit. It probably went 380. It's now about 950 feet. The thing about Dalco is that you could look it up, as Casey said. Look up the numbers. Nobody's making anything up here, folks. 18 strikeouts, 18 walks, 21 strikeouts, 20 walks. Got taken out of a game once after he'd thrown 170 pitches. It was the second inning. He threw 270 in a game one time. So you have the undeniable, inarguable facts of baseball statistics for once matching the legend and supporting the mythology. When I was shooting the scene in Bull Durham, well, you probably remember they flooded the field to get a day off, a night off, which was not based on Dalco's career, it was based on mine, because we were in Amarillo trying to get a day off, and we flooded the field. Our reward was we ended up with a night off in Amarillo, which was really we hadn't thought that one through very well. But we were shooting that because the whole movie was shot in North Carolina, in Wilson, North Carolina, where halfway through the evening I remembered that Cal Ripken Sr. had said, this is where Dalco threw the pitch through the screen 120 feet away, and I, 3 in the morning, climbed up and, call it myth, there was a hole in this welded wire fence 25 feet above where the catch would be. At any rate, Steve, because of the affliction and disease of alcoholism, ended up dropping out of baseball with the injury. And in the early 90s, well, from the 80s and the 90s, there was not just lost years, but lost decades, it's fair to say, of Steve's life, where people who knew him and loved him and cared about him couldn't find him. Migrant farm work jobs, wandering the streets of LA. Wife didn't know where he was, family didn't know where he was. People like me and Joe Altobelli and Cal Ripken Sr. when he was alive. I called all these people. Everybody lost track of Steve. I've written about Steve before, not just in Bull Durham, in articles, in pieces. Every 10 years, somebody says, what's up to Steve? Well, I'm here and happy to say that Steve is here, and that it is something of a miracle, thanks to his family, who finally found him and brought him home to New Britain, Connecticut. And I have been nominating and voting for Steve Dalkowski as long as there's been a reliquary, as Terry can tell you. And today's New York Times, and I think Washington Post, and everybody is finally recognizing that Steve is not only with us, but here to be honored, not just for the paintings he didn't make, but for the fact that he has survived. He had a gift. He played the game at the toughest levels. This is a hard game, folks. This is a hard game to play. And I'm known for exaggeration, but I didn't make anything up with Steve Dalkowski. And I want to introduce you to the sister of the fastest pitcher who ever lived, Patricia Kane, and the legend himself, Steve Dalkowski.
I'm not much at speaking, so I'm just going to say one thing. Thank you very much, everybody. God bless you all. Thank you.